Welcome back, class. During the last session, session number 4, we looked at a few items dealing with hunger. We looked at the hormone PYY as well as the substance THC and how they may have an impact on our appetite by enhancing it. We looked also at the psychology of hunger, how our psyche can have an influence on our hunger as well as our eating behavior. We examined such things as taste preferences as well as situational influences on eating, and issues dealing with obesity and weight loss. Now we'll be examining more closely factors associated with emotions. Theories in physiology of emotion. What is an emotion? Emotion, arousal, behavior, and cognition. The components of emotion are bodily arousal, there's some physiological change, expressive behavior that we express in somehow, and then conscious experience that we know something, consciously are aware of it. So how do these three pieces fit together to explain emotion is what we'll be discussing. There are several theories of emotion that we want to look at. We first have James Lange theory, then Cannon-Bard theory, and then Schachter-Singer two-factor theory. Basically, when it comes to emotion, it's a response of the whole organism involving 1. Physiological arousal, 2. Expressive behavior, and 3. Conscious experience. In James Lange theory, what they propose is that arousal, physiological arousal, comes before emotion. It arises from awareness of a specific bodily responses to emotional arousal stimuli. So our heart races and then we feel afraid. We have some physiological change in our body and then we put on that the reason why, and that's where the emotion comes from. Cannon-Bard theory says arousal and emotion occur simultaneously at the same time. So we have the emotion arousing stimuli and they trigger both the bodily response and the subjective experience of fear. So as we see our heart begin to race, we also experience fear. So going back again, back to James Lange, the heart races and then we experience fear. With Cannon-Bard, the heart races and the experience of fear happens at the same time. With Schachter-Singer theory, here we have general arousal, some sort of physiological arousal happening in the body, plus the conscious cognitive label. That is what they see as emotion. And they also propose this thing called the spillover effect, which we'll see a little bit more clearly in the next slide. So, in Schachter-Singer two-factor theory, suggests that emotions do not exist until we add a label to whatever body sensations we are feeling. I see a stranger. We turn and we face a stranger, and my heart is pounding. Is it fear, excitement, anger, or lust? Or did I have too much caffeine in my coffee? The label completes the emotion. Now, in a study by Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer in 1962, subjects experienced what they call a spillover effect. When arousal was caused by injections of what turned out to be adrenaline, the subjects interpreted their agitation to whatever emotion the others in the room appeared to be feeling. The emotional label spilled over from others. So let me give you a real quick perspective here. So we give somebody a drug. They don't know how it's going to affect them. It causes a little bit of agitation in them. We put them in a room with some other people. The other people are working for us, the researcher, and those people in the other room with the subject here, they can act happy. And at the time where they're acting happy, the subject is completing the survey. The survey is assessing what their feelings are currently. And what they were able to determine is this: if they were in a room with a bunch of people who were acting happy, they then would label their emotions as happy. If they were acting angry, they would label their emotions too as angry. So in essence, the emotions from those other people in the room spilled over and had an influence on the person who had this generalized bodily arousal with no clear reason why. But when they labeled the emotion as being this or that, then they felt that emotion. So some other theories of emotion. We have Zajon-Ledoux theory. Some embodied responses happen instantly without conscious appraisal. What this basically is getting to is the idea that we could have sort of an emotional response to something and not consciously be aware of it. All right. Lazarus looked at cognitive appraisal defines emotion, sometimes without awareness. And again, going back to what we talked about in the previous chapter, we had the high road and the low road. The low road, if you recall, is the idea that things can happen that would be out of our conscious awareness, and that's what this is pointing to here. So the notion with these two theories here is this. With the Ledoux theory, the idea is we could have some sort of emotionality without consciously being aware of it. They were able to show pictures with hidden images in them and see when the people were in the fMRI machine, see the amygdala light up, which is, again, as you recall, our emotional center location within our brain. So there's some sort of emotionality there, but we may not necessarily be consciously aware of it. And when it comes to cognitive appraisal, we will define things, and how we define them will dictate what type of emotion that we experience. So theories of physiology and emotion when it comes to our awareness or not being aware of them. In the two-track brain sensory input may be routed to the cortex as in A, thinking high road, for analysis then transmitted to the amygdala where we have our emotionality, or can be routed directly to the amygdala via the thalamus for an instant emotional reaction, the speedy low road. So if something happens in the speedy low road, we could have an emotional response, a fear stimulus, but we may not know consciously why we are afraid. This would be akin to if, for example, you're walking out in the woods and all of a sudden on a path you see something, you're not consciously aware of that you've seen it yet, but yet you respond with fear. You jump away. But in the middle of the jump, your brain, your conscious brain may catch up to what's going on. It may show you a snake. So again, at one level, we had that fear response, but we're not even consciously aware as to why we were responding until our brain, our conscious brain, catches up to us. So here's a summary of some of those theories of emotion. James Lange, our awareness of our specific bodily responses to emotional arousing stimuli. We observe our heart racing after a threat, and then we feel afraid. Cannon-Bard, the bodily response plus simultaneous subjective experience. Our heart races and we experience fear happening at the same time. Schachter and Singer, two factors. We have the generalized arousal plus the conscious cognitive label. Arousal could be labeled as fear or excitement depending on the context. So if our heart is racing and we're at a party, we're excited. Our heart is racing and there's a strange figure in the corner of the room coming toward us, then we have fear. Zajon and Ledoux, instant before cognitive appraisal. We automatically react to a sound in the forest before appraising it. So we have this fear response before we know exactly what it is, but that's what happens. We have the fear before we know exactly what it is. Lazarus, we have the appraisal. Again, we make this assessment, is something to be feared or not. Sometimes with our awareness, sometimes without. But it defines where our emotion is. So you're babysitting or something, or house sitting in the middle of a storm, and you hear some noise downstairs in this unfamiliar house. If you say it's just the wind knocking a branch up against the house, then there's nothing to be concerned of. You're not going to have the experience of fear. If you think somebody just broke into the house, totally different story. You will experience the emotion of fear. So let's look at a few other things when it comes to emotions. We have Embodied emotions, basic emotions. Most emotion scientists agree that there's anger, fear, disgust, and sadness and happiness. Izzard has joy, interest, excitement, surprise, sadness, anger, disgust, and so on, including also shame and guilt. Others have added things like pride and love. Are these emotions biologically distinct? Now, therein lies a little bit of an issue. When we are describing an emotion, the emotion itself, the subjective experience of the emotion, may be somewhat complex and be very layered. But when we talk about the biological, the physiological response to those emotions, there's not going to be that much of a difference. So our heart may race when we see somebody when we're angry at them, but it also may race when we're in love with them. So the idea here is that these emotions are not necessarily biologically distinct clearly from one another. So, in theories on physiology of emotion, here's what we know. To identify the emotions generally present at infancy, they analyze facial expressions of infants. And what we see here are examples of joy, anger, interest, disgust, surprise, sadness, and fear. And I still don't know what they did to the baby with fear, but whatever they did to it, hopefully they don't do it again. Key point here about this is this. At this early point in their life, they did not learn these facial expressions. They're already there, however. Therefore, the notion is that there are certain types of emotions and our facial expression related to them that most likely are pre-programmed. We come into this world with this stuff already pre-programmed and hardwired into our body. Emotional arousal. Like a crisis control center, the autonomic nervous system, which we've talked about before, arouses the body in a crisis and calms it when danger passes. So this goes back to a previous chapter that we've talked about. We know that sympathetic system, when it activates, it gets us ready for flight or fight. Pupils dilate, salivation decreases, we start to sweat a little bit, respiration increases, heart accelerates, preparing for us to fight or to run away. So once, however, these emotional arousing stimuli goes away or it has been resolved in some way, the parasympathetic system comes to calm the systems down, turning down or turning off the things that were turned up or turned on when the body went into red alert. Now we're getting back into green status, pupils contract, salivation is allowed to increase, the skin dries, respiration decreases, the heart slows down. It calms everything down. So we see that different emotions can share common biological signatures. A single brain region can serve as the seat of different types of emotions. Some emotions have distinct brain circuits, but the idea it is very difficult to be able to discern them biologically speaking. And again, this is what we see. Now, one key interesting fact is the lie detector, which we mentioned at the beginning. The lie detector works on trying to gauge your physiological responses to things. But because the physiological responses can be shared by many feelings and many types of emotions, it's not always going to be a good judge of how someone may be telling the truth or lying. So polygraphs measure emotion-linked autonomic arousal, changes in breathing, heart rate, and perspiration. About one-third of the time, the polygraph test results are just plain wrong. Okay? And that is one of the reasons why we don't allow lie detection tests or polygraphs measurements into a courtroom, the courtroom of law. We don't do that because they're just not really that trustworthy from that perspective. Sometimes people have the ability to fool the lie detector test as well. Now, something that has had a little bit more success to some extent is the concealed information test is seen as being more effective. The polygraph technique is designed to detect a person's guilty knowledge of a crime. Here, the concealed information test is asking more about are you concealing something? And is this concealing of information can be more easily detected under certain circumstances. Now, detecting emotion in others. The brain detects subtle expressions in reading nonverbal cues and nonverbal threats. And we know this. Personally, you know this probably as well. For example, if you are in a conversation with somebody and they seem to be shifting their eyes away from you, acting somewhat nervous, they're saying the right things, but their body language just seems wrong, you're more likely to perceive them as telling you a lie simply because their nonverbals, which we usually do not control as easily as our verbals, are telling you a different story than what they're saying. So facial muscles also reveal emotional signs. Deceit is difficult to discern sometimes. When viewing the morphed middle face, which evenly mixes anger with fear, physically abused children are more likely than non-abused children to perceive a face as angry. Again, based on previous experiences. So the idea here is there's going to be a little bit of gray area, and being able to determine what emotions people may be expressing in their faces. Expressing and experiencing emotion. Again, let's look at gender. Women generally surpass men at reading emotional cues. They have better emotional literacy. Their emotional responsiveness and expressiveness are somewhat different as well. Also, when expressing empathy, experience emotional events more deeply and remembering them more easily. Now, one thing that we can see is this. Male and female film viewers did not differ dramatically in self-reported emotions or physiological responses, but the women's faces showed much more emotion. Look at the chart on the side here. We see men in blue and women in the red. And so we can see the number of expressions. So when we look at a film that's sad or happy or scary, we can see the number of expressions. In each case, sad movie, happy movie, or scary movie, the number of expressions that females express or show or illustrate are much more than that of men. So they're just more expressive in their emotionality. But physiologically, the responses were no different, and their self-reported ideas of what they were experiencing of emotions were no different either. Researchers have manipulated gender-neutral faces. People were more likely to see it as a male when it wore more of an angry expression. So if we look more to, I think it's the one on the right, is more of a gender-neutral face. And that means it's neither really male or female. When they show this face and then they change it slightly to make it more angry, then the face is going to be more perceived as a male face. So we do see that there's this emotionality or this emotions that are more maleness or more femaleness than emotionality. So expression, experience, emotions. Again, cultured emotion. Signs across cultures. Crying when distressed, shaking the head with defiance, smiling with happy. Facial muscles speak universal languages. The degree varies among and within cultures. Gestures meanings vary from culture to culture as well. For example, a head bobbled in some countries or cultures is a sign of agreement. For us, more of a nodding the head up and down means yes, I agree with you, as opposed to a bobblehead that may be more indicative of I agree with you and different in other cultures. So what we see primarily is the notion is this, is that being able to read somebody's emotions and for them to be communicated will also sometimes depend on what culture they come from. Here, looking at culture and emotion, we can see some faces, despite what culture you may be from, they always sort of communicate to us a certain degree of emotion. So if we look at these faces here, they are happy, sad, angry, and so on. Let's look at what they are. So that's happy. What is B? Surprise. What is C? Fear. And what about D? Sad, E, anger, and F? Discuss. So again, we see that certain types of things seems to communicate to us despite what culture you may be from, that these are basic facial expressions that seem to be global. So remember this, like most psychological events, emotion is best understood not only as a biological and cognitive phenomena, but also as a social cultural phenomena as well. And finally, the effects of facial expressions. Facial expressions communicate, amplify, and regulate. So when you're talking to somebody and you're trying to emote, your facial expressions will emphasize this. There's also something called the facial feedback effect, the tendency of facial muscle states to trigger the corresponding fear, anger, or happiness. For example, if you put your face into a smile, you will tend to feel happier. If you put your face into a frown, you'll tend to feel a little bit more grumpy. So that's what it means. So when someone tells you to smile a little bit more, they're telling you to be a little bit more happy, because the research would say if you do put your face in a smile, you'll tend to associate with those types of feelings that are most aligned with a smiling face. So what we see here is a variety of things that tells us that emotions give us a lot of information and how we express ourselves and how people are going to interpret it. And finally, behavior feedback effect. The tendency of behavior to influence our own and others' thoughts, feelings, and actions. So when you behave a certain way, it can have an influence on other people as well. Okay,